Good afternoon, everybody. So you've seen all the previous videos, and previous to this, we were talking about the emergency management coordinator and direct emergency management roles and responsibilities. So just kind of recapping. Now, what we're going to start doing now is, in the beginning, we'll bring up more videos. Is we're going to get into what I discussed before, and that's risk assessment. Risk assessment is very important when, as a new emergency management coordinator, direct emergency management, where do you start? How do you put together hazards within your community? What is the definition of risk? What does that look like for your community? Because every community is different, and especially First Nations. Now, you'll see there are templates out there, using big words, using whatever. At the end of the day, what we're going to be talking about is the First Nations cultural impacts of risk and hazards within our community. So we're changing the script and making it more inclusive of First Nations. The other risk assessment that you'll see is for like the municipalities. It's for big cities that can actually respond, they have consistent economic development, that it's bringing in revenue and resources, and that they have taxpayers' money, they have all of that, compared to a risk of what a First Nations has to deal with. And what we have to deal with is, in terms of how we run the nation, is we have capital funding, which is Indigenous Services Canada, that we have to apply for. If we want to build new infrastructure, if we want to improve on a building, if we want to expand and make our community better in terms of drinking water, infrastructure for future growth, of our community, in terms of families coming back home and wanting to live there. Also, too, is the comparison to some nations that have the economic development of having a gas station, having a casino, having all of that revenue. So if something does happen, they can tap into that immediate revenue to rebuild what a risk or a hazard has impacted your community. Houses burning down, stores being, damaged, whatever the case. It's different for First Nations, and that risk also too is when we start doing this, and I'll talk to this in a minute here, is we have to build a risk assessment, hazard assessment based on a First Nations perspective, what it looks like, and then we have to put it in a report in terms of what Indigenous Services Canada can understand. And as a First Nations doing a risk assessment within our nation, we understand the cultural impact, we understand all of that, and the day-to-day life of a First Nations. We can now translate that to Indigenous Services Canada that's looking at this risk assessment and not understanding why that impacts a First Nations community more than a municipal community. So that's what a risk assessment is taking all of that, putting it into a document, laying it out. So one, you can focus on what are your priorities, your hazards, translating it into a culturally, I don't call it sensitive, but a cultural way of life of what's really vulnerable for First Nations. Because it's completely different than a normal municipality or city. It's completely different. And also, too, is the reason why this is a hazard, this is what the vulnerables are, and this is why we can't respond due to fixed funding agreements or not having an economy built to rebuild, to expand our nation, to improve it. We're always relying on Indigenous Services Canada. That's where emergency management comes in, is to expand that way of thinking, that if we have an emergency management risk assessment, vulnerabilities, we put it all out there and we say, this is why we need to develop an emergency management department, a plan, because this will build the economy, a better way of life on the First Nations. We'll be able to prepare a lot better. We'll be able to save our cultural vulnerabilities, our cultural way of life. That's what we're going to talk about today. It's a lot today, and I know but I just wanted to say that in the very beginning because this is what a First Nations risk assessment is different than anyone else, and we'll talk about that right now. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is urban interface fires. What an urban interface fire is you take a community, let's say we'll start with Northern Alberta, First Nations. The communities up there are within the forest protection area. So the urban interface concept of it is homes, buildings, infrastructure, everything is within that forest protection area. And so it's a different response. Because because of the forest around you, fire smarting, the urban interface is going to be, there are two different responses. So you've got the urban interface is one, you've got a response into the wildfire, which is forestry, wildland fire. And also two, because there's buildings, infrastructure, there's homes, the other portion of it is structural firefighting. So the urban interface is how do you merge those two together and respond together in a wildfire and structural firefighting. And it's not just forest protection area. I come from Southern Alberta. We have grass fires, and grass fires we have so much prairie. Grass fires can be just as devastating as wildland fires. The concept of urban interface is still the same. You've got a wildfire response to the grass fire, and you've got and you've got a structural portion of it. If the grass fire goes right within the community. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. So what this is here is a risk assessment, hazard assessment. You'll hear both. Is when you start to look at where do I start with my plan? How do I take this? And at this point, I'm assuming that you have some sense of funding from Indigenous Services Canada to do this report for future funding, for continuous funding through, for the Emergency Management Program. So what you're going to do is you're going to start looking at laying out what are the hazards that you see from previous experiences. You might have had a lot of wildfires if you're in the forest protection area. You might have had a lot of grass fires if you're even in central Alberta, which you'll have both forest and you'll have grass fires all in one, or southern Alberta, where the majority of it's going to be grass fires. Looking at that, and now once you look at that, you're like, okay, that's for this example, we're going to start going, okay, that is one hazard. This is not in any order. What we're doing here is we're just laying out, what are the hazards? What have we seen? What in the past? We start looking at, and this is where the cultural aspect in our small community is I talked before, is part of that planning piece is talking to your community, talk to the elders, talk to the people that, that have been there longest and they've dealt with fires, floods, you name it, even before you've developed an emergency management department. So back to this, urban interface fires, that is one hazard. The exposures that we're looking at, hey, an urban interface fire happens. What are we looking at? Homes are going to be destroyed. We're looking at, could be if you have a good economic development within your community, it could be a gas station, it could be anything that is exposed to that wildland fire in terms of it's not fire smarted, the grass is not cut, or you don't have the capabilities of getting funding to fire smart in your community, which happens regularly. That's okay. That's what you want to recognize. If you see that, that's all right. You need to put that in your report because that's what's going to give an understanding to Indigenous Services Canada and to Chief and Council, everybody, that why an urban interface is so important. Okay? Now we start looking at what are the vulnerabilities here. So we look at I'm going to talk about different communities. Because again, like I said, every community is different. The vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities, and that's why we tailor it to your community. What is a vulnerable? So we look at here, Indigenous Services Canada capital funding. A lot of First Nations, when it comes to any new infrastructure, if you want to build a road, if you want to expand your community because it's growing, if you want to build a daycare or renovate the daycare, you have to go to capital funding, and you have to rely on that. If your community relies solely on capital funding because it's got no revenue from stores, from casinos, which some nations have, this is a vulnerable aspect of your community, because now if something burns down, you don't have the money right away to rebuild that. You have to go through the process again. Capital funding. If your daycare, we had an incident back home, the daycare flooded, it was really cold, all the pipes burst, the floor collapsed. They went through capital funding to rebuild that daycare. And it takes a long process. You think about it. If you deal directly with capital funding, there's a process. You're not getting that building back. You're not getting that home back that you need right now until you go through the process of applying to Indigenous Services Canada for capital funding. That's a process that takes time. There's reports, there's everything that they need before they give the funding. That's what makes your community, some communities, very vulnerable. If you look at the other side of the coin, you have some communities that, they're thriving a little bit more because of whatever. They have 2 casinos. They have 1 casino that's bringing $30, $40 million back to the nation. So if something was to unfortunately happen with urban interface, homes get devastated, the nation will have the capabilities of rebuilding it right now. They'll make an agreement with Indigenous Services Canada, say, okay, we have the money, we're going to rebuild, and then we'll get reimbursed from you at a later date. But there's an agreement, there's everything signed. Indigenous Services Canada says, yep, no, we will. Here's a guarantee, we will reimburse you money. So the vulnerability is not that, doesn't impact them as much as a community that relies on capital funding. Then we look at here, we look at nation-owned businesses, which I kind of talked about before, is now we've got a community now that's got businesses now, and they rely on these businesses. It could be fuel. It could be a remote community. And you can imagine if you're a remote community, you have a gas station, you rely on that fuel, that gas station, to your fuel day to day. If the gas station was to burn down because there's no fire smarting, there's no pre-planning, there's no emergency management plan for that, the vulnerability is going to be the gas station is closed. Where do I get my fuel now? I've been in some communities where I have a diesel truck. I have to drive an hour away to get diesel because they don't have a diesel pump in the community. That's a huge vulnerability for the community. They have to look at that too and say, man, I've got to make sure that we put a plan for all of our businesses. If you look at grocery stores, let's look at the basic needs of a First Nations. Fuel, food, just to survive if you're a remote community or even just a normal community. This is a nation. We've got Strathmore, we've got Calgary. Either way, there's travel time. Some families don't have the capabilities of a vehicle. So you see how the vulnerable is for the banned businesses? It's this. You may have businesses that bring in money and revenue. The vulnerability piece I'm talking about is if they break down, what does it look like for your community? Why is it important to put a plan in place? And that plan will be, which we'll talk about next, is how can we respond to it? Do we have the capability of responding? You see how this all is starting to work together now? You put this report together, it's going to strengthen your ability to go to Indigenous Services Canada and say, I need $400,000 to build a response capacity for this hazard, which is urban interface, flooding, everything. So, like I said, I'm going to keep going with this, but I just want to put so everyone understands. You're putting a list together here of flooding. You could be, we talk about wildfire. Let's talk about Winter storms. Okay? It's just a list of things that you're looking at, and you're going to start doing this process. So right now we're sticking with this one right here, and I'll get to this in a minute. The vulnerabilities are back to the band-owned businesses. That's a vulnerability. You need to make a plan for that. What does that look like? Start talking to the businesses. Start talking to your economic department within your nation that has these ideas of building new structures, new infrastructure, new expansion to the nation. What does that look like? This is how emergency management starts to, when I talked about before, is how they merge in with everything. How they recognize, okay, if we're going to build a gas station and they say they want to put it here, you got to start looking in terms of emergency management. Okay, what are the vulnerabilities of putting it there? How can emergency services access that building or that new business? What does it look like to protect it? Make sure that within their funding agreements that if you have a fire service, I won't get too deep in that side in a second, but just real quick, if you build a new building, make sure they put a fire hydrant there and make sure it's an appropriate one. It's going to flow enough water to put that building out, and it's not going to overtax your water treatment plant. In some locations, the water treatment plant pulls off a river into the water treatment plant and then gets out to the community. That's a big consideration. That's a big, huge vulnerability when it comes just to water source is if that happens, the water supply coming out to the community, and if a fire service is attaching hoses to the fire hydrant to draw water to fight the fire, that water treatment plant will not keep up with the water that's being drawn out from the fire service. So that's something that we're talking about here. That's a vulnerability. Okay? Then we start looking at the cultural impact, which is very important, and it should be a part of our vulnerabilities. So in terms of an urban interface fire, I can speak with back home on Siksika Nation. We have an area where we do our Sundance. If a fire was to impact that area, it would be devastating for our community because the Sundance has been in that area for as long as I can remember. So if that was to be taken away, the cultural impact would be significant to your community. Indigenous Service Canada may not understand that because they don't know our native culture. They don't know the significance of why that is important. We have an annual powwow. Other peoples have annual powwows or ceremonies, different ceremonies across Alberta. And they're specific to areas, buildings. Take that away. How does that impact our culture? If we didn't have our powwow for 3 years, that would impact our community because we look forward to that powwow. We look forward to our relatives coming back to the nation and we visit. There's teepees there. We have different nations there that are visiting. This is how our First Nations, how we interact with each other. That vulnerability is very important. You take that away, it takes away our cultural identity. It takes away how we bring in people, how we communicate, how our community thrives during a time when mental health isn't there. Powwows will rebuild and strengthen that mental awareness, that mental breakdown that's happening. Could be addiction, it could be anything. Our powwows will do that. Bring everyone together for celebration, to watch beautiful dancers, everything. And we talk and we visit and we just do what we do as First Nations. So when we talk about vulnerability, it's what happens if urban interface fire affects that? How do we look at it? So we got to look at planning. When we start talking to Indigenous Services Canada, say, look, we need money to fire smart our Sundance area. We could have priorities of what we're going to do for fire smarting with recognizing this here. We need to explain to them what that impact would look like. Then we start looking at vulnerable groups. I touched on it a little bit. So with an urban interface fire, it could affect your community where there's an evacuation now. Now you have, depending on your population, the ratio between elders, youth, and just adults, mom and dad. If you have a high percentage of elders, what does it look like to evacuate that vulnerable group? Because we respect our elders. They are our knowledge keepers. They guide us. They remind us of our culture. They guide us in the right direction. So we're staying with that cultural way of life. We need to make sure that if they're one of the vulnerables, where are we going to evacuate them to? How are we going to evacuate them? Also, too, is if there's vulnerables that have mental health issues, addictions, and health could be they're wheelchair bound, right? That is something that's a big consideration when you have a wildfire because you're evacuating them. Do you have and I'll go to capabilities in a second here. Vulnerable groups are going to be, and even people that are on fixed incomes. Now, when I talk about fixed incomes, if we look at, there's a high percentage of people on the nation that there's not that many jobs for the most part in some of the nations where they have a fixed income. It could be anything. And they don't have the capabilities of having a vehicle. No, the vulnerabilities is, okay, you're telling people to evacuate. You don't have the capability of driving to the evacuation center. What does that look like? Urban interface fire, flooding for winter storms. Okay? So that's kind of a brush over of what vulnerabilities will look like when you figure out, okay, first hazard, urban interface fires. This is what we need to consider. These are vulnerable. These are the people that we have to protect. These are the people we have to plan for. And these are the people that we need to start looking at. What we're into next to is the response capacity. Up here, I got infrastructure, I've got comms. I talked about infrastructure briefly, is we look at urban interface fire, right? The one thing they need to do an urban interface fire is water. You know as well as I know that just access to water is not as readily available as we like to think. And what I mean by that, by access to it, is if there's a river that you can draft off, okay, you have access to water. And it's within your community that you can draft water into your fire engine or into a water tank or whatever the case and get it quickly. Sometimes that's a drive away. Also, too, is your water treatment plants. The water treatment plant might only be designed to supply basic needs for your community, which is drinking water, sewage. That's it. Because that's what they plan for. That's what they can start off with. However, sometimes the water treatment plant, if you start to now look, okay, you figured out all this vulnerability now, you're thinking, we don't have the capacity to respond to any of this because we don't have a fire service. We don't have an interface trained firefighters that can do wildland fire and structural firefighting. And this is where the emergency management plan, this emergency management coordinator can actually work with the fire service and say, okay, cool. Yeah, we're going to get a fire service. We've got funding and everything. Okay, let's look at how I can support you. And I would mention this as your water treatment plant, which I know a lot of good fire chiefs will consider water treatment. Will consider hydrants. Will have that consideration when they start a fire department. What I'm talking about here is how emergency management and within your risk assessment, you can support the fire service in saying, this is why we need to look at the capacity of our fire service. Yes, we have a fire service, but do they have capacity to respond effectively with our current water treatment plants? So you have supporting documents in a response from EM to Public Works, goes to Council. You see how emergency management is involved with everything by doing this risk assessment. Going further with the capacity to respond is up here it says comms. I'm talking about communication. How do we communicate within a First Nations? The number one thing, and it's right across the board for any First Nations, any response, is communication breakdown. And I look at a First Nations from Northern Alberta to Southern Alberta, Central, you name it. That's one thing, communication breaks down in a lot of ways. One, they don't have any reliable ways of staying in communication. What I'm talking about is radios, internet. And when I talk about internet, reliable internet, because there's some nations I know, including my own, we have our own internet service. However, it's based on everything else is running, right? The building has got a generator that if the power goes out, the power will click in at the building where the internet service is being distributed, and we continue having internet. But if that breaks down, well, now we don't have reliable internet, and everybody in your nation has signed up for your own internet. Again, this is where emergency management comes into play and starts supporting the internet services and says, okay, you guys have a generator. We start planning for that. What is it going to look like? And planning would be simple as this. In your plan, because the lack response can be, okay, we've already got a place that we can rent an appropriate 55 kilowatt generator. We're going to order it, or we're going to get it over there because we need to communicate to the people. Radios, internet, just phones. If cell service goes out, we rely on cell service, and even location. If you're in a bad cell area, what does that look like? So all of this with the vulnerables, start looking at what is the capacity to respond. So this is where right here is your plan. Taking this, you're looking at vulnerabilities now. What is your plan? Recognize here that what are the response capabilities. So now when I talk about tailoring your plan, that's what I mean. You can't put in your plan that you're going to communicate via internet if you don't have good internet service. You've got to make sure that your plan is going to be okay. We are going to communicate through internet. However, in our plan, we are going to go rent a 55 kilowatt generator and bring it to where the internet's being provided so we can communicate to the people. That's the plan. See the difference? Don't put something within your plan like this. Power goes out, the generators will kick in. If you say it like that, have you checked if every building has a generator? And if they don't, you can't put that in your plan, because now you look at chief and councillor looking at this plan, look at everyone's looking at this plan, and they say, well, Stacy, in your plan, you said the generator's going to kick in. We don't have a generator. It's going to affect how you are as an emergency management coordinator and director. Same with flooding. Flooding, they're going to have the same concept of vulnerability. It'll be tweaked a little bit, but you'll put the same concept. Flooding, what's the vulnerability if you get flooded in your community? How are you going to respond? Can you respond? If you can't, this part here is how you work with the different departments, public works, fire department, everything. That coordination between the emergency management coordinator and director of emergency management to coordinate to get funding or support a department getting funding so they can respond in whatever plan that you've coordinated or put together in the overall plan for your community. All of this here, I know you see this E&C, trust. This is how we build trust in our community. I know back, my grandma, I moved back to Siksika Nation, saved my life, my grandmother, and she always said that you've got to build that trust. You've got to build that communication between the community. And what I mean by trust is that if you say you're going to do something to an elder, you have to make sure you do it. If you say you're going to go to an elder and say, I'll be there at 9 o'clock, better do that. That's our way of life. Elders will always rely on your word. And when you do a good risk assessment like this, when you start putting a plan together, people trust you. They see that you're looking at the big picture, and specifically to your First Nation. They will see it. They will trust in that plan. They will say, you know what, we've got it. We've got a good plan. Nothing's perfect. That's okay. But this is a good starting point for funding, for building the foundation of the emergency management department and team. And all of this too, communication. This plan is only as good as who you give it to and making them understand risks. So on top of this is communicating to the community, to the departments, what a risk assessment is. How did you come up with it? Getting their input. When the good result for the communities that I've been involved in, if you get the different departments involved in this, they feel part of that plan. They feel like they made a difference within that plan. They feel heard. They feel like they're important enough to be put in that plan. And they'll trust you a lot more. Going back to that trust. And that communication is, once you're done, you put it together, sit down with the people, with the elders, with the community. You sit down and say, here's our plan. Here's our risk assessment. Get feedback. Show them what you've done to build that trust again. I'll leave you with this. My grandma always said this to me. Stace, you need to go off reserve. I'm like, what do you mean, Grandma? You need to go off reserve. You need to get as much knowledge as you can. Here I'm talking about emergency management. Once you get that knowledge, come back and teach your people. Bring emergency management, bring all your expertise back to the community, make your community strong. Now, this is just, again, we're brushing over a lot of the risk assessments. There's more to it than that. Reach out to HazardScape, because each one of these is a deep dive and more specific in terms of, let's say, cultural response. What does it look like for cultural response? How do we make a plan for that? Question. Also, too, is gives you an opportunity to call us, to engage with us, and we can sit down with you and answer all your questions you may have that you're looking at this now. Also, too, is sometimes meeting over Zoom or Teams or whatever, it's good, it's got a time. However, the way I am, the way HazardScape is, our trust, our interaction with the First Nations communities, we want to go in and we want to build that trust within your community. So an opportunity to call us and we come out to your community. Show us the vulnerable stuff that is important to you, how we can help answer your questions, guide you. Again, thank you very much for your time. More to come. We'll see you then. Have a great day.
Thanks for joining us at HazardScape. You can subscribe to our YouTube and find our ad-free training videos by becoming a supporter on Patreon with a network of other Indigenous peoples looking to make their communities safer. And remember, know your HazardScape and be prepared.